Now we're going to look at some of the trends that transformational development workers and theorists think about when it comes to who is not flourishing. Where is this lack of flourishing going on? And is it centered in certain parts of the world? And how does it affect other areas of lack of flourishing? So one of the most profound comments from Bryant Myers in his book on transformational development is that many still experience the world as one of painful toil. And primarily when we think about underdevelopment or lack of flourishing, we think in terms of how much money people earn per year. Is the per capita income at $1 a day, $2 a day, $10 a day. Now, why would transformational development theorists be so concerned about salaries, about annual income? And the reason is that income seems to be the key to political voice. It's the key to education. It's the key to healthcare. It's the key to moving yourself, of course, out of hunger. The key to having sanitary water. And so those living on less than $1 a day or less than $1.50 a day, which would be $500 a year, tend to be the ones who also deal with many of the other markers of underdevelopment or lack of flourishing. And you can see here that then the percent of the world's population living on $1 a day is about 12% on the left-hand column here, which would be around 880 million people. When you bring it up to $2 a day, let's say, that's nearly half of the world's population. Well, it's about 40% of the world's population. Half of the world's population lives on less than $1,000 a year at $2.50 a day. Almost 3.2 billion people. So this is, if we consider that nearly half of the world's population is living in the kind of poverty that leads to lack of political involvement, lack of choices for education, difficulties with literacy, difficulties with getting health care, clean water, then we definitely, Myers is correct. Nearly half of the world experiences the world as one of painful toil. Of course, those, in very wealthy situations might also describe their situation as painful toil, but not by development standards or not by standards when it comes to lack of flourishing, at least when we have basic standards like education, political voice, lower infant mortality rates, and a reasonable lifespan, in the 60 or 70 or 80 year range. What is a life of toil? Some of the examples here. 22,000 children die each day due to poverty, and these are ones that Bryant Myers referred to as the invisible ones. They're not on the conscience of the world. They're not making the news stories. Nearly 27 to 28% of children in developing countries are underweight or undernourished, which leads to other problems, cognitive problems, and other health problems. The Millennium Development Goals of cutting in half the proportion of underweight children will be missed by 30 million in sub-Saharan Africa, and 72 million children of primary school age in the developing world, nearly 57% of them girls, were not in school. So here are some examples of injustices or lack of flourishing. Now, are things getting better or worse? If you look at the number of people living on $1 a day, $2 a day, the numbers have gone down significantly. I mean, you can see those living on $1 a day was 35% in 1981 and down to 15% by 2005. Now, part of that is inflation, of course, because maybe what $1 bought you in 1981 costs $2 today, and so those living on $2 today are nearly half of the world's population. But that's not really what the story is. The story is actually, if you compare China with 1 billion people, or 1 in 6 of the world's population, has done so well since 1980, as it became more open to capitalism, that it brought people out of poverty, out of abject poverty. Which means, on the left-hand side, when you're counting China, each year fewer and fewer, or a smaller and smaller proportion or percentage of the world's population was in abject poverty, because China was getting more and more developed. But if you take China out of the equation, you can see that those living on $1 a day has not particularly improved, maybe from 20%, 22% down to 18%. And the same with $1.25 a day, $1.50 a day, etc. So we have not moved the needle too much as far as decreasing global poverty levels. But it also is a testimony that a nation like China can bring people out of poverty by opening up to capitalism. The government system is not capitalistic. Well, there is no such thing as a capitalistic government system. But the government system is a one-party, which calls itself communist, but the economic system is increasingly capitalist. When we look at some other areas of lack of flourishing or injustice, about 0.1% of the world's population controlled 25% of the world's financial assets. So obviously a great deal of that is in the United States. Whereas you can see the world's richest 20% consumes 76% of the world's resources. The world's poorest 20% consume 1%. Others have demonstrated this as a funnel, where at the very top the 20% consumes a huge amount, and then the bottom percent consumes the smallest amount. I think this is always an economic reality. As long as there is a such thing as richer and poorer, the question is how much can you decrease the size of that funnel to make it more equitable. But obviously, by nature of being rich means consuming more resources, and so the wealthier 20% will always consume more than 20% of the resources, and the poorest 20% will always consume less than 20%. But there is something that seems quite unjust here, and which leads to demoralization, to lack of political voice, lack of options, when 20% of the world's population is living on 1% of the wealth. And as you can see from this slide here, things have gotten worse over time. People say, well, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. But that's a story which has actually increased more and more. In terms of how much richer were the richest, what was the distance between the richest and the poorest countries? In 1820, the richest countries were 3 times richer than the poorer countries. And by 1913, they were 11 times richer, and then 35 times richer. You can see by 1992, the richest countries were 72 times richer than the poorer countries. So there is a widening gap, meaning that those with resources are consuming more and more. And again, in itself, that does not mean that those with lack of resources are not flourishing, but the side effect of inequality can be a tremendous amount of demoralization and marginalization, which does lead to lack of flourishing. So it's really the side effects of inequality. You can see here some regions of the world are far more inequitable than others. Sub-Saharan Africa, the richest 20% is far more inequitable compared to the poorest, and whereas other parts of the world like Europe and Central Asia tend to be the least inequitable. In other words, while there is a richer 20% and a poor 20%, the difference between the two is not as great as it is in Sub-Saharan Africa and in Latin America and the Caribbean. So there's a Gini index, Gini index, which rates the richest and or the most inequitable countries, or where the distance between the richer and the poorest is the greatest. You can see here the Gini index for certain countries, Mexico being listed as the highest inequality between the richest and the poorest, where certain countries in Europe, for instance, Finland, Belgium, Austria, Czech Republic, Luxembourg, Sweden, Denmark, all tend to be far more equitable than the United States, Poland, Turkey, and Mexico. So this is not every nation here. This is just an example. But the average of these nations shows that, like, if we were to say, well, what is a flourishing country's, or inequality gap? What is a target inequality gap? Because it can't be 1-to-1. It can't. If you had a inequality ratio of 1-to-1, then nobody would be unequal. Everybody would have the same salary. So what's a reasonable target? And the OECD here lists 8.9 times, the richest being 8.9 times richer than the poorest, is not necessarily a target, but it's an average. And so for a nation to be where, like Mexico, where the richest are 25 times richer than the poorest, that seems like it's about 4 times more unequal than the world average. Here's the funnel I was showing you. It just seems to be a reality that the richest 20% will consume the 80% of the resources, and the next 20% around 12%, and then the poorest 60% consume about 5% of the rest of the world's resources. And when I say consuming world's resources, really what that means, it's not just access to petroleum or, when we say consuming resources, for instance, having access to wood for the furniture or to food for agricultural purposes. Really, it's all of the intangible resources as well. It means making money on the stock market and, owning companies that provide value through ideas, software companies and services, medical services and such. So the richest nations have access to so much more of this than the poorer nations. So that's really a question for you to consider, is what is the connection between inequality and lack of flourishing? And some sociologists have noticed empirically through research that inequality within a nation where the richer are 25% richer than the poorest can lead to a lack of social cohesion. It can lead to ethnic violence, especially if you have an ethnic minority, like in Indonesia and the Philippines, where the Chinese are the richest but are also an ethnic minority. Then there's a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment. Globally, if the United States is known as one of the wealthiest nations, there can be anti-American sentiment. So it can lead to a lack of social cohesion, especially within a nation. And other social problems like drug use and homicide have been related to, and mental illness have been related to a demoralization because of inequality. You can see here some empirical evidence trying to link what is the correlation coefficient of homicides to income inequality. Do countries with the highest income inequality also have the highest amount of homicides? And because of ethnic violence, jealousy, or other social issues that arise because of income inequality. This correlation coefficient is actually not extremely strong. It's just a weak connection between the two. Okay, we're going to move on to another subject in the next, related to transformational development needs globally in the next section.